From New York, this is Democracy Now!
American leadership must meet this new moment of advancing authoritarianism, including the growing ambitions of China to rival the United States and the determination of Russia to damage and disrupt our democracy.
As President Biden addresses a joint session of Congress tonight for the first time, we spend the hour looking at Biden's foreign policy record over his first 100 days in office and over the past half-century.
Above all, Biden is an empire politician. He is someone who believes that questions of war don't really matter on a moral level, but how does it impact America's credibility, security, and prestige?
We speak to The Intercept's Jeremy Scahill about his new sweeping investigative project, Empire Politician, about Joe Biden's stances on war, militarism, and the CIA going back to the early 70s when he was first elected as a senator in Delaware. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A warning to our audience, the next two stories contain descriptions and images of police violence. The FBI has opened a civil rights investigation into the police killing of Andrew Brown Jr. in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. An independent autopsy confirms Brown, a 42-year-old black father, was shot 5 times by police, including in the back of the head. Brown's family and their lawyers have only been allowed to see a 20-second video of the killing from a single body camera, which shows Brown had his hands on the steering wheel of his car when he was shot dead. New surveillance video shows a group of officers in a car in the moments before Brown was killed. A lawyer says just 4 seconds passed from the time they arrived on the scene and the time they fired shots. On Tuesday, 5 people were arrested as protesters defied an 8 p.m. curfew in Elizabeth City to demand justice for Andrew Brown. In California, recently released body camera footage shows Alameda police killing Mario Arenales Gonzalez, a 26-year-old Latinx man, with officers kneeling on his back and shoulder until he loses consciousness, contradicting a previous account of the incident from police. Officers had alleged Gonzalez, who is from Oakland, died the morning of April 19th after suffering a medical emergency during a scuffle while they attempted to restrain him. But the footage has revealed Gonzalez was alone in a park when officers arrived at the scene after receiving complaints of a man who is allegedly intoxicated. Gonzalez calmly speaks to the officers before they attempt to place his hands behind his back. He screams as police are trying to handcuff him. The officers then pin him face down on the ground. One officer has his knee on Gonzalez's back, and another is kneeling on his shoulder for a few minutes until he becomes unresponsive. Police also allege Gonzalez had died at the hospital, but the footage shows he stopped breathing on site, with one officer saying he had no pulse. Gonzalez's family held a news conference Tuesday and demanded an investigation into his death.
Alameda police officers murdered my brother Mario. My mother was heartbroken to see Mario's last moments. Mario was a kind and humorous man. He was a loving father and the caretaker for our brother with special needs. The police killed my brother in the same manner that they killed George Floyd.
In international news, India's official coronavirus death toll has topped 200,000 as its devastating second wave continues to grip the nation. 360,000 new cases were reported over the past day, yet another record. Researchers say the true number of cases and deaths is likely far higher. As international assistance starts to trickle in, medical supplies remain dangerously low and hospitals and cremation sites are overwhelmed. This is an ambulance driver in New Delhi.
New makeshift cremation platforms are being constructed because there's no space for cremation inside the crematorium. A few platforms are being constructed here and a few are being constructed on the other side.
One group estimates at least 100 journalists in India have died of COVID, close to half of those within the past 2 weeks. Press freedom groups warn journalists are also facing increasing obstruction and censorship by the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Elsewhere, Turkey announced a full nationwide lockdown to slow its COVID surge. Turkey reported over 37,000 new infections over the past day, the fourth highest daily caseload in the world. Brazil has rejected Russia's Sputnik V vaccine over concerns about its safety, citing a lack of quality control and efficacy data. The maker of Sputnik V said the decision was politically motivated, pointing to a report earlier this year that said U.S. government officials pushed Brazil to turn down the vaccine. The World Health Organization has not yet approved Sputnik V for emergency use listing. Here in the U.S., the CDC issued new guidelines Tuesday saying fully vaccinated people do not need to wear masks outdoors except for at large gatherings such as concerts or sports stadiums. This is President Biden.
Beginning today, gathering with a group of friends in a park, going for a picnic, as long as you are vaccinated and outdoors, you can do it without a mask.
The Seattle City Council in Washington passed a resolution urging Biden to support a waiver on patent rights for COVID-19 vaccines. Councilmember Kshama Sawant said, quote, "This resolution demonstrates our movement's rejection of the status quo of profit-driven vaccine apartheid and vaccine nationalism and our fight for vaccine internationalism, for a people's vaccine," she said. Meanwhile, a new Washington Post ABC News poll finds a quarter of women are worse off financially than they were before the pandemic versus 18% of men. And 27% of people of color say they're in a worse financial situation versus 18% of whites. The Biden administration's proposing a $1.8 trillion plan to invest in education, health care, child care, and paid family leave. Biden will unveil the American Families Plan during his first address to Congress this evening. The package will be funded in part through changes to the capital gains tax and a crackdown on tax evasion by the wealthy. Biden's proposing an $80 billion funding increase for the IRS over 10 years to fund the effort. White House officials say the move could generate $700 billion over 10 years. If passed, individuals who earn more than $400,000 a year would face a higher likelihood of an audit of their taxes. In Chad, at least 5 protesters were killed Tuesday as calls grow for a transition to civilian rule. Chad's been in a state of turmoil since the battlefield death of longtime President Idriss Déby last week. On Monday, Chad's new military leaders who took power following Déby's death banned demonstrations and named the runner-up of recent presidential elections as the transitional prime minister. The military government's rejected talks with the rebel fighters accused of killing Déby, who have been threatening to advance on the capital. In Ethiopia, a senior government official says up to 200 people were killed this month in clashes between Oromo and Amhara communities, Ethiopia's 2 largest ethnic groups. The fighting in the northern Amhara region has reportedly displaced over 250,000 people, including one small town that was completely burned in March. It's one of several flashpoints in Ethiopia. In the Tigray region, thousands of people have been killed since conflict broke out last November, with widespread reports of war crimes, including sexual violence against women and girls. The fighting's led to food shortages, and aid groups warn millions are at risk of famine. In Burkina Faso, 2 Spanish journalists were killed Monday in an ambush while on an anti-poaching patrol in the eastern region of the country. Journalists David Barayin and Roberto Fraile were working on a documentary about poaching and were traveling with about 40 people when an armed group attacked them on a road leading to the massive forested reserves of Palma. An Irish conservationist, Rory Young, was also killed, and at least 4 others were reported missing. The Committee to Protect Journalists condemned the attack and is demanding a thorough and transparent investigation. In El Salvador, Pretrial hearings on the 1981 El Mozote massacre are being held this week. Nearly 1,000 civilians from across 7 villages were killed in the massacre carried out by U.S.-trained Salvadoran military officers. One of the expert witnesses, Stanford University political scientist Terry Carl, detailed the on-site presence of U.S. military advisor Alan Bruce Hazelwood with the Salvadoran army at the time of the massacre, providing new insight into what Carl referred to as a sophisticated cover-up of the events on behalf of the Reagan administration and the Salvadoran military junta.
The presence of an American advisor with Salvadoran General Monterosa, whose name is Alan Bruce Hazelwood. If this had been made public at the time, in my opinion and the opinion of Thomas Enders and other secretaries of state, this would have cut U.S. aid because this is illegal.
Back in the U.S., Democrats and voting rights advocates are raising concerns that recently revealed census data will lead to an underrepresentation of Latinx residents as a result of former President Trump's attempts to exclude undocumented people from the 2020 census. Texas, Florida, and Arizona, which all have growing Latinx populations, had been projected to gain 1 additional House seat each, while Democratic states with large Latinx populations, such as California and New York, lost seats. California Congressmember Norma Torres tweeted, quote, "The Trump administration did everything it could to prevent an accurate count in the 2020 census. Now Californians are paying the price. The culture of fear he instilled within our communities jeopardizes billions in funding that our state deserves," she said. Meanwhile, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has asked Attorney General Letitia James to look into legal options after New York came just 89 residents shy of maintaining all of its congressional districts. It lost a seat. The Department of Homeland Security is limiting the power of Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents to arrest immigrants in or near courthouses unless they present an imminent danger or a national security threat. Meanwhile, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas launched a probe to address the threat of domestic violent extremism within his department. In other immigration news, the group La Resistencia is reporting an ICE flight earlier this week transferred 64 asylum seekers from the U.S.-Mexico border to Washington State's Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, a for-profit immigrant prison run by Geo Group. In medical news, Oxford University researchers say their new anti-malaria vaccine proved highly effective at preventing disease among children in a small clinical trial in West Africa. The vaccine showed up to 77% efficacy in a study involving 450 toddlers in Burkina Faso, where malaria is endemic. Oxford researcher Adrian Hill said it's the first time a malaria vaccine has reached a goal set by the World Health Organization.
They want a malaria vaccine with 75% or more efficacy by 2030. We think we can do that. So 77% is the highest yet and could really add to the existing tools that we use to control malaria.
Malaria, which is caused by a mosquito-borne parasite, kills 400,000 people around the world each year, most of them small children. Back in the United States, Idaho's Republican Governor Brad Little signed into law a bill banning most abortions as soon as a fetal heartbeat can be detected, which can happen as early as 6 weeks before many people know they're pregnant. However, the bill will only go into effect if a federal appeals court upholds another so-called heartbeat ban, prompting reproductive rights groups to accuse the governor of signing the law simply to appeal to his, quote, radical followers. And in Massachusetts, nurses at St. Vincent Hospital in Worcester have been on strike for 8 weeks to protest understaffing, nurse-to-patient ratios, and cuts to support staff, which have jeopardized patient care and staff safety and caused over 100 nurses to leave the hospital. St. Vincent Hospital is owned by Tenet Healthcare, the third largest for-profit hospital company in the United States. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, President Biden is addressing a joint session of Congress tonight for the first time. It comes on the eve of his 100th day in the White House. Biden is expected to unveil his $1.8 trillion American Families Plan to expand educational opportunities, child care, and paid family leave. He's proposing to fund the plan in part by raising the capital gains tax for the nation's wealthiest households and cracking down on wealthy dodgers. While much of tonight's speech is expected to focus on domestic issues, we spend the hour today looking at Biden's foreign policy record, both as president and over the past half-century. The Intercept's just launched a sweeping project examining a half-century of Biden's stances on war, militarism, and the CIA, going back to the early 70s, when Biden was first elected senator of Delaware. The project is called Empire Politician. It was created by the award-winning journalist Jeremy Scahill, senior correspondent and editor-at-large at The Intercept, which he helped found. Later in the show, Jeremy will join us, but first we turn to a new video featuring Jeremy Scahill produced by The Intercept.
We have never had a president with a longer paper trail than Joe Biden. He's taken so many different positions on the same issues so many times throughout his career that I sometimes wonder if Biden even knows anymore what he actually thinks about a particular issue. Joe Biden might tell you one thing one day and really believe it, and then the next day he's doing the exact opposite because he's cut some side deal that maybe we'll hear about in some years. Above all, Biden is an empire politician. He is someone who believes that questions of war don't really matter on a moral level, but how does it impact America's credibility, security, and prestige?
The youngest new face in the U.S. Senate next year will be that of Democrat Joseph Biden of Delaware. So
when Joe Biden began his run for the U.S. Senate, Richard Nixon was running a lawless administration.
We must never allow America to become the second strongest nation in the world.
The CIA is conducting operations inside of the United States. There's secret components to the war in Vietnam. And early on in his Senate career, Biden ends up on a subcommittee that is examining the issue of American war power. Who has the right to send the American people into a war? And he becomes an original co-sponsor of one of the most important laws passed by the United States Congress on questions of war.
The War Powers Act grew out of the agony of the Vietnam War. Based on its constitutional authority, Congress passed a joint resolution which obliged the president to get congressional approval.
Also, Biden becomes a very early and ardent critic of the CIA, for the perception that the White House and the CIA are regularly circumventing the U.S. Congress. And then on the other side of it, Biden becomes a totally radical warrior against leaking and against whistleblowers. Jimmy Carter nominates an outsider to be director of the CIA. Ted Sorensen, a friend of the Kennedy family, an advisor to JFK. Carter had said he was going to rein in the CIA, shrink it, reduce its budget.
But then Biden discovers, oh, Ted Sorensen actually wrote an affidavit in support of Daniel Ellsberg when the Pentagon Papers prosecution was happening. And Ellsberg was facing a century in prison under the Espionage Act. And in that affidavit, Ted Sorensen says everybody in Washington takes classified documents home, and they regularly leak far more sensitive documents to the press than the Pentagon Papers.
Ted Sorensen's nomination was dead in the water after Biden joined the Republicans. Biden was more obsessed with some random admission from a Washington insider that they had taken classified documents home than he was about actually reining in the CIA.
Republican audiences love what he has to say.
Reagan and Bush take power in Washington. Biden understands exactly what they want to do. They want to undo all of the oversight mechanisms that were put in place post-Nixon. And so Biden becomes the leading opponent of Reagan's nominee to be CIA Director, William Casey. But then as Biden sort of gets to know people, and he's big on personal relationships, he starts to back away from his own supposedly bedrock positions. So he opposes William Casey's nomination, but ultimately then votes for William Casey. So So throughout Casey's tenure, which spanned both of Reagan's terms, you see Biden on the one hand blasting Casey in public, and then privately literally collaborating to sell covert options as in American national interest. In some cases to sell wars that were being done without the very laws being followed that Joe Biden co-sponsored. He had supported the invasion of Grenada in 1983. He supported airstrikes that were intended to kill Muammar Gaddafi in 1986. In Nicaragua, the Reagan administration begins financing and arming the Contra death squads, and this would ultimately lead to the Iran-Contra scandal. Biden publicly railing against the funding of the Contras, but then does what I think could just be called a Biden.
Biden, how are you?
So Biden starts to try to broker deals. Well, we can support the Contras, Mr. Reagan, if we put this restriction on it and that restriction on it.
I think I'm looking forward to helping on this one, too. Well, bless your heart.
He would say, oh, well, that's because I'm a great compromiser. You don't compromise with death squads. And, you know, Joe Biden, very, very early on in the Iran-Contra scandal, came out and said basically that Reagan probably should resign. Reagan gives this now infamous speech in which he says that at the time I made these statements saying that we didn't transfer any arms for hostages.
My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
Reagan gives this sort of logical gymnastics speech. Who does it resonate with? It resonates with Joe Biden.
I take the president at his word that he did not know. I accept him at his word.
So in 1990, 1991, it becomes clear that the United States is going to go to war against Iraq. Joe Biden starts raising holy hell in the U.S. Senate about the War Powers Resolution.
Biden gets so furious during this battle with the White House and Bush's utter disdain for congressional war powers that he takes a principled stand and actually votes against the authorization.
And Biden actually lives to regret that he didn't vote in favor of that war because it ended up being very popular and was helping to sort of boost the American morale in the post-Vietnam era.
Aggression is defeated. The war is over.
Biden then, almost overnight, transforms into one of the most hawkish figures on Iraq policy in the United States Congress. He becomes a leading voice calling for the overthrow of the Iraqi regime.
And it's going to require guys like you in uniform to be back on foot in the desert, taking taking Saddam down.
And so what you see is Biden emerging from the 1990s as an empire guy.
Now, in the case of the war in the former Yugoslavia, Biden was a very early advocate of the U.S. intervening militarily. Biden was among the first to call it a genocide in Bosnia. But at the same time, Biden also sort of rejected notions that this is just a humanitarian cause. Biden would talk about it throughout the 90s as defending American prestige.
We should go to Belgrade and we should have a Japanese, German-style occupation of that country.
As Biden is agitating for the United States to be militarily involved in the former Yugoslavia,
Haitians in the United States are watching as a brutal junta, death squads, overthrow the democratically elected government of the leftist president Jean-Bertrand Aristide.
And Biden gives an interview on Charlie Rose in which he basically says, nobody cares about Haiti.
If Haiti just quietly sunk into the Caribbean or rose up 300 feet, it wouldn't matter a whole lot in terms of our interest.
The world he viewed the stakes in Europe as something that the U.S. could gain by getting involved. In the case of Haiti, it would have been purely humanitarian in nature.
And then the Clinton administration, immersed in the Monica Lewinsky scandal, suddenly starts a series of wars and military actions. So Biden supports all of them. He supports the bombing of a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan. He supports bombing some farm in Afghanistan where maybe Osama bin Laden had been recently.
And when the FBI director comes to testify in front of Congress, Joe Biden is one of the senators who starts saying, can you clarify for me, what's the legality of assassination? And Biden seems to get the problem with the idea that America can kill whomever it wants, wherever it wants, however it wants.
Then the 9/11 attacks happen. And the simplest way to put it is that Joe Biden just supports almost everything that the Bush administration wants in the immediate aftermath. Biden not only votes in favor of the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, he plays a key role in facilitating a war based on lies.
No matter how long it takes.
Now, as president, Joe Biden is saying he's going to withdraw all U.S. troops from Afghanistan.
I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war.
This doesn't mean that the war is going to completely end. When Biden was vice president, Biden wanted to use the very forces that actually are at the tip of the spear of assassination operations instead of the large-scale troop deployment.
What he's doing is finally getting the war waged the way he wanted it, which is the CIA, special operations forces that are going to hunt down and kill the people that he determines are the enemy. If Biden had become president, 20 years ago, I think that it would have been easier to predict some of his future actions or policy behavior. But because of his age, because of the political moment that we're in, I think there are some real wild cards in how Biden is going to approach the world, including on questions of war.
That was a new video produced by Intercept featuring Jeremy Scahill, talking about his sweeping new investigative project, Empire Politician, about Joe Biden's foreign policy record over the past half-century. Jeremy joins us after break.
I got lost in my travels. I met Leo the lion, met a king and met a giant with their red might. There's the wind and the rain and the mercy of the fallen who say they have no claim to know what's right. There's the weak and the strong and the beds that have no answer, and that's where I may rest my head tonight. I saw the bright people in imposing flocks, they landed and they got
Dara Williams, The Mercy of the Fallen. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. By the way, you can sign up for our daily News Digest email by texting the word Democracy Now!, one word, no space, Democracy Now! To 66866. This is Democracy Now! As President Biden prepares to address a joint session of Congress, we're looking today at Biden's foreign policy record, both in his first 99 days in office and over the past 5 decades. We're joined by Jeremy Scahill, co-founder of The Intercept, where he's senior correspondent, editor-at-large, co-founder. Jeremy is also the host of the podcast Intercepted. He's just launched this new, remarkable project titled Empire Politician, a half-century of Joe Biden's stances on war, militarism, and the CIA. Jeremy's author of several books, including Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army, and Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield, also the name of his Oscar-nominated film. Jeremy, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Why don't you just lay out big picture for us, as you were doing in that video, what this project is doing, and then how you see it fitting into what President Biden represents today.
Well, Amy, first of all, thank you for having me on, and greetings to you, Juan. In the big picture, if you study Joe Biden's history, what you realize is that the history of Joe Biden, particularly on matters of war, the CIA, espionage, the balance of powers between the executive branch and the congressional branch, questions of civil liberties. The history of Joe Biden is really the history of the evolution of the American empire from the Vietnam War to the present. And what I think is significant is that, Joe Biden, when he first ran for Senate in 1972,
remarkably telegraphed what the sort of thrust of his argument about empire and war would be for the next 50 years. And that was that Joe Biden was not a militant opponent of the Vietnam War. In fact, he had great disdain for anti-war protesters. And he tells a story about walking in on his campus when he's in law school at the height of the Vietnam War with some of his colleagues, and they see fellow students protesting against the Vietnam War, and they call them a-holes. Biden says he wasn't big on flak jackets or tie-dye, and that he didn't really have any moral qualms about the Vietnam War, that his issue was that he thought it was based on lousy policy and was not executed in the correct manner. And, you know, Biden also really inflated his involvement, which was almost non-existent in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. He only later was forced to kind of clarify that he personally supported it, but that he wasn't doing sit-ins himself after he had made kind of more sweeping claims. So what you see as he starts his political career is that Biden is not really part of the civil rights movement. He has great disdain for the anti-war movement, but he thinks that the empire has made some mistakes in how it has extended itself in Vietnam in particular. He gets elected to the Senate. He's one of the youngest people in U.S. history and the youngest in modern history at that time to have been elected. He begins serving at age 30 years old. And Biden ends up on a couple of crucial committees at a very crucial time in U.S. history. The Richard Nixon administration was, of course, a lawless enterprise. You had not only the overt war in Vietnam, but you had secret components to the war in Vietnam. You had the CIA carrying out a spate of assassinations around the world, conducting coups, running guns, cultivating assets who were dictators, thugs, gangsters, criminals. And for the first time since the creation of the CIA in the aftermath of World War II, Congress was finally getting around to trying to confront the CIA and trying to impose restrictions and oversight of Congress. And Biden ends up in two crucial roles. On the one hand, he ends up being one of the senators studying war powers, and that leads to an extremely important law getting passed called the War Powers Resolution of 1973. Biden is a co-sponsor of that. The Nixon White House decides this is a grave threat to executive power, and they veto it. And then the House ends up overriding the veto. So the War Powers Resolution, which says that the Congress has the right to declare war, not the president, and puts restrictions on the president's ability to conduct military actions and certainly to deploy American troops without consulting with Congress. On the other side, Biden was one of the people who helped to create the Senate Intelligence Committee, which would be the first congressional body that was going to have jurisdiction over CIA activities. And so, Amy, there is a sort of two-prong part of this history. On the one hand, Biden seems to understand very well what Richard Nixon did during his time in office and very well how out of control the CIA was. On the other hand, Biden, as a new senator, starts to get a taste for what it means to have access to power, powerful people, classified information, and he develops this very complicated relationship with the CIA of sort of in public being an aggressive interrogator of the CIA, denouncing its secrecy and withholding of information from Congress. And on the other hand, Joe Biden aids and abets the CIA not only in pushing covert operations and selling wars to Biden's Senate colleagues, but also aiding the CIA in an emerging and continuing to this day war against whistleblowers and leakers.
Jeremy, I wanted to ask you, Joe Biden is unique among presidents, I guess, since the post-World War II era in terms of his understanding of how Congress works. Because if you look at the previous presidents from Nixon, Bill Clinton, George Bush, the second George Bush, Jimmy Carter, they all came into the White House as governors. And Herbert Walker Bush obviously had a long history in the CIA before becoming a vice president. You'd have to go back to Lyndon Johnson, to find a president who has actually knows how Congress works, knows how laws are passed, knows how you reach agreements to get legislation passed. But Biden seems to suffer the same problem that Johnson had. Johnson could pass great domestic policy, but when it came to foreign policy, whether it was Vietnam or his invasion of the Dominican Republic in 1965, was extremely hawkish in foreign policy. I'm wondering your sense of how you see Biden moving forward in terms of the U.S. expanding the U.S. empire, if it can be still talked about as a empire with possibilities of expansion.
It's a great question, Juan, and I'll just answer it by saying that the White House is pushing as the sort of premier issue on war regarding Biden this notion that Biden is going to end the war in Afghanistan. I think it's really important, just for accuracy's sake, to recognize that the plan that Biden is implementing now was the plan that was developed by the Trump administration. And it's basically the plan that was on Biden's desk when he left office and when Trump left office. And so Biden said, you know, I would have done this differently, but agreements are agreements. The Trump administration signed this agreement with the Taliban, so we're going to abide by it. Now, there are other policies where Biden says we're not going to continue on with the path of Trump. So he's playing a little bit with the notion that, the U.S. always keeps its agreement. But what I think is interesting, Juan, and it cuts to the heart of your question, is that when Joe Biden was vice president under Barack Obama, there were a handful of policy issues where Biden sort of decided that he was in the opposition and he took a dissenting view. The first one was the first year of the Obama-Biden administration. Obama's advisors, many of them, wanted to surge U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and they ultimately did that. They wanted to engage in the Coin Doctrine, counterinsurgency, which is another way of saying sort of nation building, that you have this large-scale military deployment, you set up your own infrastructure, and you're basically running an occupation regime in a country similar to what the United States did in other European allies in Europe in the aftermath of World War II. Biden says, whoa, wait a minute. I don't like what I'm seeing here. I don't think we should be having large-scale troop deployments. I think we should use our assassins, essentially. The CIA, the Joint Special Operations Command, in a small footprint to conduct anti-terrorism operations to hunt down people that we determine represent an ongoing threat to our national security. Ultimately, Biden loses in part that argument because what happens is that Obama decides to do both. He goes with a large-scale surge, and he starts escalating the use of drones, and not just in Afghanistan, as you know, Juan, but in many countries around the world. And they basically empower the CIA and the Joint Special Operations Command as really streamlined implementers of an emerging U.S. assassination policy. Now that Biden is president, essentially he is getting the war waged the way he proposed back in 2009. He's going to pull out the large-scale U.S. military presence. There are a few thousand troops and 16,000 contractors that are on the ground there. But what he's saying is that he's going to keep these hit teams in the region to do surgical strikes. And the risk for Biden is that he ends up in a scenario akin to what happened with President Barack Obama in 2014, where he actually has to redeploy U.S. troops to Iraq in the battle against ISIS after having declared the war over and initiated this made-for-television withdrawal from Iraq in 2011. So, to wrap this part of it up, Juan, I think it's fascinating that Biden has spent his entire life railing against executive overreach, demanding that Congress be in charge of declaring war. And he may well be presented with a conflict around the world where it's going to really call the question on which Joe Biden shows up, Joe Biden, commander-in-chief, or Joe Biden, who spent most of the past 50 years as a senator demanding that Congress be given its proper authority.
Now, I wanted to ask you about another major foreign policy issue that Biden will deal with, and that's relations with China. There's a very interesting column in today's New York Times by Thomas Friedman, who is arguably one of the most influential. one of the most influential. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Thomas Friedman's column in today's New York Times, he's arguably one of the most influential voices of the U.S. neoliberal elite. He said, and his column is titled, "Is There a War Coming Between the U.S. and China?" And he goes on to say, what has made this return of Chinese, Iranian, and Russian aggressive nationalism even more dangerous is that in each country it is married to state-led industries, particularly military industries. And it's emerging at a time when America's democracy is weakening. Of course, he doesn't mention the United States' major defense industry and how our state is married to our defense industry. But he goes on to talk about Taiwan as a major producer of the most advanced chips in the world in terms of artificial intelligence. And he goes on to say, and as much as U.S. strategists are committed to preserving Taiwan's democracy, they're even more committed to ensuring that TSMC, the big chip maker in Taiwan, doesn't fall into China's hands. Because he goes on to say, in a digitizing world, he who controls the best chip maker will control a lot. It almost sounds like Friedman is urging Biden to draw a line on the issue of Taiwan when the entire world has already recognized that Taiwan has historically and legitimately a part of China. Your sense of how Biden will act when it comes to relations with China?
Well, Juan, we just came off of an era under the Trump administration where overt xenophobia and racism became official U.S. policy. And the Biden team is still implementing many of the sort of underlying principles of the Trump policy, if you will, but doing it in a more diplomatic manner. And what's always absent, and this is certainly what's always absent from Thomas Friedman's columns for sure, but what is almost always absent from discussions about U.S. relationship with China, U.S. relationship with Russia, is the U.S. role in the world. There is no more hostile, threatening, powerful force in the world right now than the United States government. And you always need to look through the lens of how other nations are responding to the United States. You can't just say, oh, China is aggressively pursuing this technology, or China is in countries throughout Africa right now, and pretend that it's some ominous development that a major world power with 1/7 of the world's population would be interested in expanding its influence or securing its future. All discussions about China, all discussions about Russia regarding U.S. policy leave out the role that the United States plays in destabilizing the world, but also provoking responses from other nations. Now, having said that, Juan, I think one of the areas to watch that does not get a great amount of attention is the way that the United States, China, and other world powers are battling for control of natural resources throughout Africa. The United States has quietly, over the past 10 or 15 years, built up a kind of covert and semi-overt military presence in Africa, while also flooding the zone with a lot of private business and contractors. China is doing the exact same thing. And in fact, China, because it is not bound by any laws requiring that it certify human rights practices, is really taking control of large parts of several African nations' natural resource supply. And this cuts to the heart of technology, precious metals, and an incredibly geostrategical important location in the world. So I think that you're going to see a lot of pressure on Biden to become much more belligerent, much more hostile to China. And the people that are pushing him to do that are going to completely ignore and minimize the role that the United States plays in provoking responses from other powerful nations.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. We're talking to Jeremy Scahill, The Intercept senior correspondent, editor-at-large, co-founder. The new project, with more than 50 articles across the Intercept website, Empire Politician, a half-century of Joe Biden's stances on war, militarism, and the CIA. Stay with us. A message by John Carpenter and Alan Howarth. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. By the way, you can watch, listen, and read transcripts using our iOS and Android apps. Download them for free from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store today. And you can get our daily news digest. Just text the word Democracy Now! To 66866. We're continuing our discussion with The Intercept's Jeremy Scahill, who's just launched a massive new online investigative project titled Empire Politician, a half-century of Joe Biden's stances on war, militarism, and the CIA. I wanted to go to the 1980s, Jeremy, and also talk about how that links to Joe Biden today. Now, in his address tonight, his first address to the joint session of Congress, it's expected he'll be mainly focusing on domestic policy. There, Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says that President Biden is more progressive than many progressives expected. But we're talking about his foreign policy. So today in headlines, we talked about a trial that's going on in El Salvador on the 1981 El Mozote massacre, that horrifying massacre of around 1,000 Salvadorans nearly killed by the Atlacatl Battalion, which was a U.S.-trained Salvadoran military battalion. One of the expert witnesses, Terry Carl, professor at Stanford, detailed the on-site presence of U.S. military advisor Alan Bruce Hazelwood in some of the pre-trial testimony. This is extremely significant, what's happened back then and what's happening today. Also, this goes to media criticism. You had Ray Bonner of the New York Times writing eventually about this massacre, and within months, because of enormous pressure from the Reagan administration, A.M. Rosenthal, then one of the chiefs at the New York Times, pulls him from covering Central America because he's exposing what happened in El Salvador. So you've got the U.S. policy in El Salvador. You've got the support for the Contras in Guatemala, what the U.S. did in its support of the both murderous military and the paramilitary death squads. And then you look at what's happening today from that very area, the number of immigrants who are fleeing north and the connection between immigration today and U.S. policy and intervention of the 1980s. Not to mention what's going on with Venezuela, with the Biden administration saying they recognize as president not the democratically elected leader, but in fact the person that both President Trump and before that Democrats also supported. Talk about the policy of yesteryear determining today and how in some ways that isn't changing and where you see openings.
Well, I think it's important to say, because this portion of history often doesn't get mentioned, that in terms of El Salvador and U.S. administrations, Jimmy Carter emerged, even though he had campaigned on a pledge to sort of confront dictatorships and to respect human rights, as the original supporter of the coup regime that took power in 1979 in El Salvador, and the subsequent killing of protesters started this civil war. And Carter, and particularly his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, believed that this is a communist menace, or at least they said that it was. And they said, well, if we don't support this military regime in El Salvador, we're going to end up with a Sandinista-style government. Cuba is going to run the deck on Central and Latin America. And you have powerful voices in the Catholic Church, such as Archbishop Oscar Romero of San Salvador, who himself was a conservative Catholic until 1979 coup takes place. He writes to Jimmy Carter pleading with him not to support the military junta. And Jimmy Carter's administration ignores Archbishop Romero. And in fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski writes to the Pope John Paul II, and says, essentially, you need to shut Oscar Romero up. He's starting to sound like a communist, and we've warned him about this. Well, a month after Archbishop Romero writes to Carter a personal letter pleading with him not to send weapons and Huey attack helicopters to the junta, Oscar Romero is assassinated, shot through the heart, while he was saying Mass, a month after he writes to Jimmy Carter.
Joe Biden at the time was a critic of the military junta in El Salvador, but he also accepted the framework of the war against communism. And Biden could have become a really militant voice, especially as a Catholic, an overtly Catholic politician, could have really gone to town on the fact that nuns, Catholic nuns, including U.S. citizens, were being raped and murdered by what was effectively a client state of the United States. And eventually, Carter temporarily stops the aid to El Salvador, and he is defeated then in the election by Reagan. Biden writes to Reagan in a very polite manner saying, I think we should maybe link our funding and arming of the Salvadoran dictatorship to investigating the murders of American citizens. Carter, on his way out the door, gives emergency resumption of military gear and weaponry and financing to the Salvadoran junta. And Reagan takes power, and then the gloves come off, and it's just a massive bloodshed in El Salvador, sponsored in part by the United States. And what you see is Joe Biden, on the one hand, denouncing the extrajudicial killings and murder, and on the other hand, trying to tinker on the edges of American policy, proposing, Mr. Reagan, I'll support financing this dictatorship, or in the case of Nicaragua, I can agree to support the Contras if we put this restriction on it, or we make sure that they only spend it in this way. And I think that this was a crucial point of development for Joe Biden on questions of war. He almost never meets a war he doesn't support. And the one time he did oppose a war in 1991, Gulf War, he regretted it and then immediately became an ultra hawk after it. But in the 80s, Biden was making deals on these really dirty questions of dictatorships and death squads. And he played a significant role in terms of his position in the Senate in not having a very clear line in the sand drawn. We don't support dictators. We don't support death squads. Biden helped negotiate compromises with Reagan rather than just militantly opposing it.
And Jeremy, going back to those Carter years, could you talk about the when Carter named Ted Sorensen, the former Kennedy advisor, as his CIA director? What happened and how Biden functioned there?
This is a wild story, Juan. So Ted Sorensen is nominated by Jimmy Carter to be CIA director. And the reason was that Carter had said he basically wanted to cut the budget of the CIA, rein it in. His campaign actually put out a position paper implying that Jimmy Carter intended to prosecute CIA officers who engaged in lawless activities. So when Carter becomes president, the CIA is not excited, to say the least. And then Carter nominates an outsider who happens to be a close friend of the Kennedy family. And Kennedy, of course, famously had his conflicts with the CIA. So Ted Sorensen is introduced to Joe Biden as the person who's going to kind of shepherd him through the confirmation process in front of the Intelligence Committee. And Biden says, to Ted Sorensen, I'm more enthusiastic about you than any other nominee in the Carter, emerging Carter White House. Joe Biden, though, starts talking with Senate Republicans who wanted to kill the Ted Sorensen nomination for a number of reasons. One, because the CIA didn't want him there. He was a CIA outsider. None of the spooks at the agency wanted Ted Sorensen to be implementing Jimmy Carter's agenda. Two, there was this sort of whisper campaign that Ted Sorensen was a pacifist who had resisted the Korean War. And three, Ted Sorensen was one of the people involved with the aftermath of the Chappaquiddick incident, where Teddy Kennedy was drunk and drove off a bridge, resulting in the death of a young woman. But Biden is sort of like playing defense for the Carter White House at the time and trying to resolve those issues. And Biden is tipped off by a Republican colleague that Ted Sorensen had written an affidavit in support of Daniel Ellsberg during the Pentagon Papers prosecution, where Ellsberg was facing more than a century in prison under the Espionage Act. And Biden gets wind of this. He gets one of his staffers to go and dig up this affidavit, which wasn't even officially filed. So they had to really dig deep to find Ted Sorensen's affidavit. And what that affidavit said, Juan, was basically everybody in Washington leaks. This is the culture of the elite here. Ted Sorensen had also said, I took government documents home when I was writing my biography, Kennedy. This is a common practice. And by the way, many of the things that elite Washington insiders are leaking to the New York Times and the Washington Post for their own reasons are far more sensitive than what Daniel Ellsberg leaked in the Pentagon Papers. Well, Biden hits the roof on this, and he starts saying to Jimmy Carter, this nomination is dead. And at the end of the day, Joe Biden publicly says of Ted Sorensen when he kills his nomination with the Republicans, I don't know what we should do with you. Maybe you should even be prosecuted under the Espionage Act yourself, he says about Ted Sorensen, for Ted Sorensen's crime of stating an open secret that, government officials take home government documents and at the time were leaking them for their own political purposes. That one then kicks off this relationship between Biden and the CIA, where Biden becomes one of the most aggressive senators in trying to go after leakers and whistleblowers, particularly when Philip Agee comes out, the former CIA operative, and blows the whistle on covert operations around the world. Joe Biden secretly aids the CIA in pressuring the Justice Department to not only go after leakers and whistleblowers, but to go after defense lawyers representing whistleblowers or leakers who are putting in requests for documents as part of their defense. Joe Biden sponsors legislation to stop this practice of what they called gray mailing. Basically, what Biden was saying is, when we arrest leakers or whistleblowers, their lawyers are then requesting in discovery all these documents from the U.S. government about the operations that they were a part of, and this could expose further secrets. So Biden played a really crucial role in trying to create rules for federal whistleblower cases where defense lawyers were not allowed to subpoena documents that would assist them in the defense of their whistleblower or leaker clients. Biden also goes on, even though he tries to kill Reagan's nominee for CIA director, he tries to kill the nomination of William Casey. William Casey, of course, one of the most infamous, notorious spies in American history. And Biden had his number. Biden basically said, these Reagan people want to undo everything we did in the aftermath of Richard Nixon. They want to get rid of the War Powers Act. They want to circumvent the intelligence committees.
Jeremy, we have 20 seconds.
And William Casey is a key player in this. So Biden tries to kill it, unsuccessful, votes for Casey, and then aids and abets Reagan's CIA in pushing covert action, including defending the 1983 invasion of Grenada. So Biden had a very complicated relationship with the CIA, and his war against whistleblowers endures to this day.
Well, Jeremy, congratulations on this massive project that has just been posted at The Intercept. And thanks for the exclusive use of running that video at the beginning, which people can watch. The Intercept senior correspondent, editor-at-large, co-founder and host of the podcast Intercept. The new project, Empire Politician, a half-century of Joe Biden's stances on war, militarism, and the CIA. Jeremy Scahill, our guest for the hour. I'll be speaking with Dan Ellsberg and Ed Snowden Saturday. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.